There is something about moms. Something about moms that just make us, even when we're fully grown and maybe even 6'5" and maybe even have a full beard, just feel safe and protected and loved. Moms are amazing. There's a connection between a mother and a child that's not really experienced anywhere else in our human relationships. They are our caregivers. They are our protectors. They love us. They expect to hear from us. They want us to text them when we reach the end of a long journey. They still worry about us well after we've moved out of the house and had children of our own. They're awesome. They're humbling. They're our moms. But there's something that's oftentimes hard for us to see when it comes to our own mother. And that is that, well, even though she's a mom, she's also a woman. It's hard for us to see her in that light. It's hard for us to realize that she is a person like anyone else and that she has dreams and ambitions and desires and goals and she feels love and pain and joy and hurt just like the rest of us. We tend to view our moms as almost these super heroic beings who just continue to serve us well after we've become adults ourselves. They look after us. They do our laundry while making our dinner and giving us everything in life. It's so hard for us to see our moms as people. But at their core, even the best mom in history is still just a woman who's just trying to do her best. And there's been times where she felt like she's failed. There have been times where she doesn't feel like she's the best mom in the world. There have been times where she is just really uncertain about everything. When Mandy was pregnant with our daughters, it was truly fascinating to see all of the different things that would go through her mind, all of the different emotions that she would feel throughout the whole process. I mean, of course, the day she found out she was pregnant, she was overjoyed, and she couldn't wait to tell me and have me share in the joy of knowing that we were ushering in new life into the world. And that joy continued throughout the pregnancy for sure, but as any mother can tell you, that wasn't the only thing that she felt in that time. She had times where she thought this was the greatest thing to ever happen in her life, and she also had just as many times as she felt so uneasy about the whole thing. She had times where she clearly knew exactly what all needed to be done before the babies were born, and she had all the gumption and energy in the world to get it done and see it through. And then she had times where she was just so overwhelmed with this whole endeavor that all she could do was just sit and cry. She had times where she was rock solid in her belief that this was going to be the greatest thing that she and I ever did together. But then she also had times where she worried, where she was scared about just about everything. She was worried about if she was ready to be a mom. She was worried about if our kids would be happy. She was worried about if the world was too dark a place for our children to be brought up in. Dealing with uncertainty and even the stress of bringing a new life into the world is not a new thing for any parent. It can be overwhelming for any mom, though. But what if the baby that you're bringing into this world came about in, let's say, unique circumstances? What if the child that's growing inside of you has a far greater purpose than any parent could ever dream up for their own child? What if the baby that you're bringing into the world was the Son of God? Mary was a wonderful young woman in her community. There was almost nobody who could say anything negative about Mary at all. She was a good girl. She was part of a great family, not a rich family or even a wealthy family by any stretch of the imagination, just common folks, but well respected within their community of Nazareth. She was just this bright-eyed young woman who just everybody loved. It was just kind of easy. She was somebody you knew you could trust, somebody who you could have her come and babysit your children while you and your husband went off on a date, knowing that Mary was going to be responsible, that she was going to make sure that they were well taken care of. She attended synagogue. She went to all the holy days. She was very virtuous in her faith. She was just kind of a unique young woman. And Mary was absolutely gorgeous. And there were a lot of young men who came to try to court her. But Mary could see past all of them. She could see past all their flattering phrases and their flirtatious remarks. And she knew that these weren't the guys that she was supposed to be with. Because this young woman, and most biblical scholars think that Mary was between the ages of 13 and 16 years old when the Christmas story plays out, she was going to wait for the right guy. And she would know in that moment that he was the one. And one day Mary met Joseph. She'd kind of seen Joseph around town from time to time. He was a local carpenter. He'd done work and repair on other people's homes and been out and about within the community, but she never really noticed how strikingly handsome he was until now. As a carpenter and somebody who works with his hands, Joseph was very strong. And so he had all this muscle to go with his rugged good looks. Just a look from Joseph was enough to melt Mary's heart. Whenever Joseph would speak to her, she could feel her heart leap within her. She knew this was the man that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. She was absolutely and unequivocally smitten. And finally, one day, after what seemed like forever for Mary, I'm sure, Joseph asked her what she considered to be the most important question of her young life. Joseph approached Mary and asked if she would be his bride. And with all this excitement and all this just overwhelming joy that she experienced in that moment, Mary screamed out, "Yes, I will marry you, Joseph." It almost seemed like things in Mary's life were perfect. She had a man who loved her and was making plans to marry her and building up this life with her. She had the favor of nearly everyone in town. She had the love and support of her family back home. Everything in this teenage girl's life seemed to be picture perfect. But one moment changed everything for her. Mary was at home one day, kind of handling her household chores and her responsibilities that she has to do every single day of her life. And all of a sudden, as she's in the house thinking that she's alone, she gets that feeling. The one that we kind of talked a little bit about last week, that sense that I'm not alone anymore. And Mary turned around, and in a moment she thought there was a man in the house. But just one glance at him showed her that this wasn't any just typical man. I mean, the robes the guy was wearing were so unbelievably white, they practically were glowing. Mary knew almost immediately this was an angel. Now, last week when we talked about the shepherds and their experience with angels, I told you that one of the things that shows up in Scripture nearly every time an angel has a conversation with any member of humanity, it usually starts off with the phrase, "Don't be afraid." But in Mary's case, this is one of the only times that rule doesn't seem to apply. It's almost as if the angel is just so excited to tell Mary what he's come to tell her that he almost forgets. We see what the angel says in Luke chapter 1, verse 28 in the first part there. He says to her, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you. This is such a unique greeting in Scripture. It's not exactly the way that any angel has ever addressed any member of humanity. And so Mary, if she's able to think anything in this particular moment outside of the obvious, if she's able to comprehend anything of what's going on, there has to be a part of her that says, what is this guy talking about? And the angel goes on from there to tell her that Mary is one of God's most favorite people, that he has seen her devotion to him, and he knows that she is just this wonderful young woman who has just a solid moral core to her, and that she has a love for God that is unmatched. And so out of the entirety of all of humanity, God has made a decision for Mary. The angel tells her that she is going to have a child, a son, and that she's going to name him Jesus. And Mary's a little, surprised to hear this news at the very least. I mean, Mary's got to be thinking in her head, I don't know what this angel knows about human biology, but there are certain things that have to happen that eventually lead to a child. And well, in my life, those things have not happened yet. And so Mary kind of asks him, like, how is this going to be possible? Because I've never been with a man before. And the angel almost out of character says, well, simple. He's God. And so Mary kind of takes a moment to herself and she kind of thinks this through. Because this is an awfully huge thing that this angel has just asked of her. We can kind of imagine what's going on in Mary's head in this moment, because up until this particular moment in time, everything in Mary's life seemed perfect. Like everything was going about as smoothly for her as it could. And then all of a sudden, in an instant, here comes this angel to give her news that almost derails the course her entire life has been on up to this point. See, in Mary's day and age, in her culture and her society, the notion of an unwed teenage mother, that's just something that didn't happen. Not to say it didn't happen. I mean, there were instances where it did happen, but it was just something you did not do. Because to them, to her family, her getting pregnant outside of wedlock was one of the deepest and most offensive things that she could do, one of the most shameful things that she could do to her entire family. What would anybody think about this scandal? What would her parents say about all of this? What would her synagogue leaders say about this? What would Joseph say about this? See, this is a bigger decision than just, is Mary going to have a baby or not? Because in this particular time period, it's possible that Mary's father could have become so angry with her and so disappointed in the shame that she brings on her family that he'd be well within his legal right, all the way back to the law of Moses, to take her outside of their home and have the men of Nazareth stone her to death. Like I said, this goes all the way back to the law of Moses. We see it in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 20 and 21. It says, "But if this accusation is true, and no evidence of the young woman's virginity is found, they will bring the woman to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city will stone her to death, for she has committed an outrage in Israel by being promiscuous while living in her father's house. You must purge the evil from you." This isn't just Mary making the decision to have a baby. This is Mary possibly risking everything to do the will of God in her life. This is Mary possibly risking her very life. This could lead to her death. And so while the angel gives her this news, and the angel seems to think this is really great news, you have to think that there's at least a moment where Mary considers all of this. And after she has pondered the weight of all of this decision, after she has looked at this from almost every angle that she can, Mary makes a choice. We see that choice played out in Luke 1, verse 38. It says, "See, I am the Lord's servant," said Mary. "May it happen to me as you have said." And then the angel left her. Understand, Mary has just taken the biggest leap of faith in her young life. She has just made a decision that is bound to have ramifications that she does not know about yet. She doesn't know how all this is going to work out for her, or even if it's going to work out for her. The reputation that she's built up in her lifetime is gone. The reputation of her family is now going to be tarnished forever. Mary's going to have to live with the disapproval of her parents, at the very least here. She's going to have to live with the quiet whispers of the people around her, the people that she once considered to be her friends. She's going to have to live with the gossip being told amongst all the ladies in town. Because who's going to believe this story? Who's going to believe Mary when she says that an angel appeared and told her that she was going to be pregnant even though she's still a virgin? I mean, that's a hard sell no matter any way you slice it. And even though Mary knows that she's going to have to deal with this kind of ridicule, as word begins to spread, and as more and more people begin to talk about the fact that Mary is now pregnant outside of wedlock, Joseph sends word to her that absolutely shatters her heart. Joseph, the man that she loves, the man that she was so excited to spend the rest of her life with, sends word to Mary that he's going to divorce her, albeit quietly. And even though this is hard for her, even though losing the man that she loves is devastating to her, there's still a part of her that understands. Maybe even there's part of her that feels bad for the way that she's inadvertently hurt Joseph. There's part of her that maybe is frustrated that to do the will of God, the thing that God has asked her to do in her life, is going to end up costing her this man that she loves. And now her whole life seems to be crashing around her. How can she possibly do all of this? How can she possibly handle the weight and the burden that God has placed on her shoulders alone? And maybe even now she's beginning to think, why would God allow this to happen to me? Fortunately for Mary, God decided that she didn't need to do this alone. God decided Joseph needed to be included in what was going on. One day, Joseph kind of approaches Mary, and almost in secret, you can imagine. I mean, he wants to be sure of this before he lets news leak out that he's still going to marry her. So in kind of this secret meeting that he has with Mary, Joseph tells Mary about this unbelievably crazy dream that he had had. And about how in the midst of that dream, an angel approached him and told him, don't be afraid, because Mary's still been good to her word and has continued to save herself for you. What's growing inside of her is being brought on by the Lord. And that she's going to give birth to a son, and that you should name him Jesus. And when Mary hears Joseph tell this all to her, she just breaks down in tears. She's overcome with emotion in the midst of that. Because the reality is that her future's still uncertain. She doesn't know what's going to go on next. She doesn't know any more of the ramifications that this choice to follow the will of God is going to be, but she doesn't have to carry this burden alone. Because Joseph is with her. And the two of them can share this. Mary also knows that Joseph is taking on a lot here. Because now the rumors that have been floating around town about her, now they're going to include him. Now the reputation that her soon-to-be husband has cultivated in his community is going to be forever tarnished. Because Mary chose to follow the will of God in her own life. She understood that Joseph is making a sacrifice. That the two of them to be together are still going to face hardship. But Joseph looks at her and says, we're going to face it together. Well, during the course of Mary's pregnancy, Caesar, in his infinite wisdom, decides that a census needs to be taken. And you can kind of see the picture play out in your mind if you think about it, that Joseph approaches his now very pregnant soon-to-be wife and gives her the news that we have to go to Bethlehem together. And I'll remind you that the trip from Nazareth to Bethlehem is a 3-day journey, and at this point Mary is definitely in her final trimester. And so you can kind of just see it as Joseph gives this news to his beautiful and wonderful, very pregnant almost wife, that they now have to travel for 3 days. You can almost see the expression on her face as she says, you got to be kidding me here. As they make the journey together, Mary is just uncomfortable. There's just no way that this trip is going to be comfortable for any woman in her scenario. I mean, it's once you reach that stage of your pregnancy, everything's uncomfortable anyway. And so now she's having to deal with the normal uncomfort level of being this far pregnant, to add on to that riding on top of a donkey, which isn't exactly a smooth ride. But even throughout all of this, there's moments where Mary catches herself looking over at Joseph and marveling at the sacrifice that he's made for her. Not just in all the decisions up till this point, but also in this decision right now, because Joseph has chosen to let Mary stay on the animal while he walks for 3 full days. When they reach Bethlehem, Mary is confronted with yet another ripple effect that her decision to follow the will of God has created in her life. Because now they're in a town that's not their own, they're in a place that's far away from their home, and none of Joseph's relatives are going to let them stay in their house. None of them want to have this controversial couple under their roof. And because Bethlehem is not a very large city, and again, King David and a lot of his children had a lot of other children, every inn in town is booked solid. And when Joseph approaches Mary and says, hey, this guy's willing to let us stay in his cave barn thing, Mary takes a deep breath. Of course, that's where we're going to stay. This seems par for the course as far as everything else in this pregnancy has gone for her. And she sits in the cave that night in the midst of this horrible, just unholy stench. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been around farm animals very much, but if you get farm animals together in a confined space that doesn't have a lot of breathing going on in it, that is a smell. And so Mary, who's again very overwhelmingly pregnant at this particular point in time and can't get comfortable even if she was sitting on the most luxurious sofa that had ever been created, is now trying to find some way to be comfortable in the midst of this cave. And while she's trying to just wiggle her way in this barn to just be even remotely comfortable, Joseph reassures her. He redefines his love for her in this moment. He reaffirms his commitment to both Mary and the child that's growing within her. And Mary thinks for a split second that in the midst of the chaos that their lives have been for the last several months, that maybe, just maybe, for a few moments, her and Joseph can just sit together. Can just have a quiet moment, just the two of them, without the whispers of the people of town, without the questioning looks of family members, and without the giggling of the children saying unbelievably hurtful things. Maybe for just one moment, Mary and Joseph can just have a quiet night together. So, of course, this is the moment where Mary's water breaks. She couldn't believe it. I'm certain. She looks at Joseph with just a panic-stricken face and tells him that it's time. And she watches as Joseph's eyes grow about 4 sizes bigger than what they normally are as the realization of what is happening is about to take place. And Joseph scurries off in the hopes to go find help, and Mary's just sitting in the midst of this unbelievably uncomfortable place, in the midst of this huge smell that she just cannot escape, no matter how hard she tries. And there has to be a point in her mind where she thinks, why now? Why is God choosing this moment? Why is God choosing this place for his son to be born? Why is God allowing all of this to happen? And Joseph, who's more than a little shaken up, returns, and he's got a midwife with him. And Mary enters into full-blown labor. And when she's in this place, she's experiencing pain that she's never felt before in her life. She's been experiencing emotional pain for months now. And now she's experiencing the worst physical pain that she thinks she can ever endure. And she's wondering in the midst of all of this, where is God? Why has God let this happen? In a moment, everything flashes before her eyes. All of the painful things that have been said to her face, behind her back, all of the ways that people have talked to her, in front of her, the ways that they've shot accusatory glances at her, the way that she's had to endure just all of this stuff in the midst of this, to have the baby that God has asked her to have. And she's wondering, where is God? Because in that moment, Mary's feeling complete and utter abandonment. She's panicked. And for the first time in all of this, the phrase finally comes across her mind. This is too much for me. And it's in that moment that thought gets broken by a sound. And it's the most beautiful thing that Mary's ever heard in her life. The sound of a baby crying. But it's not just anybody's baby, it's her baby. And suddenly all the pain and the shame and the misery that Mary had been feeling right up until that very moment is in an instant gone. And Mary begins to cry. Not tears of sorrow, not tears of shame or remorse, or even tears of abandonment. But now Mary is crying tears of joy. Because for this young woman, This is the single most amazing moment of her life. Of course, God didn't abandon her. He had given her a gift. She knew that she was still going to face all kinds of ridicule. She knew that things for her and her husband weren't going to be easy from this point on, but now there was somebody else to join with her. And she knew that the three of them could face anything together. She knew that even though things were going to be difficult, God would still be there for her. Nothing about what God asked Mary to do was easy. And we have a tendency to be very naive in that thought, to think that, oh yeah, Mary just agreed to be the mother of God. How could you say no to that? But the truth is that everything that Mary had to endure was not simple, to say the least. There were many different moments where she might have questioned more than anything else why God decided to have this happen to her. Times where things were so painful for her as she was hearing very hurtful things said to her face, as she was hearing even more hurtful things behind her back. There were times that maybe she felt that this was more than she could handle. And there were probably all kinds of moments where God seemed so far away from her in this. Maybe even moments where Mary asked herself, did God just come to me, ask me to do this, and then leave me high and dry? And while we may not understand completely everything that Mary felt during this time in her life, I think all of us probably know that feeling. That feeling of just pain and hurt. And even that feeling that God has abandoned us. And the striking thing to me is that for whatever reason, this time of year really seems to accentuate that for a lot of us. It's likely that for many of you, this Christmas isn't quite as joyful as Christmases past. I know for sure that this wasn't the Christmas that I originally had planned in my life. And this has just been an unbelievably stressful and difficult and even, I'll say it, even painful year. 2020 has just seemed to bring one big disaster after another. And so there are likely a lot of us wondering, where's God in all of this? And maybe we're wondering, is God with us at all? The irony, of course, being that we are in the midst of the season where we celebrate God coming to us. And yet so many of us feel like God is nowhere near us. But if we can glean anything from the story of Mary, it's that God is still with us. Even in the midst of pain and hardship, even when it seems like everything is just too much, God has not abandoned us. Now, I don't want you to be misinformed. That doesn't mean that in our lives that we're not going to experience that pain, or that we're not going to experience fear, or that we're not going to experience feelings where we feel abandoned by God. It doesn't make it hurt any less to have a preacher tell you that God hasn't abandoned you yet. It doesn't make that pain any bigger. What it means is that a big part of following God, a big part of being a Christian, of taking the name of Jesus in our lives, a large portion of that, it means that we have to trust that even when everything seems like it's collapsing in around us, and even when it seems like our life is nothing but one disaster after another, that somehow, some way, God is going to use it for good. Paul reassures us in Romans 8:28. He says that we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. I'll be real with you, that doesn't necessarily make it any easier. But what Paul is telling us here is that if we can hang on, if we can hold on to our faith and trust that God is somehow going to use this incredible pain that you're experiencing right now even, if we can trust that God is somehow going to use that for good, even if that means we got to cling to that thought with white knuckles and hold on to it with every ounce of strength that we've got, I believe that God won't let us down. I believe that even in those moments where it feels like God has abandoned us and maybe I should just let go and maybe I should just give in to this despair that I feel, that if somehow we can just hold on a little longer, God won't let us down. I believe that because I don't think God let Mary down. That even though she was experiencing all kinds of hardship and uncertainty, and she didn't know how things were going to go, and there were times where it felt like God was so very far away from her, God would just use little things to remind her that he was still there and that she was still cared for. Things like letting Joseph in on this. Things like that feeling of getting to hold her baby for the first time. One of the things that I know to be true in my own life is that when I have felt those times when life has felt too painful and things have been too overwhelming, and it's been hard for me to hold on to that thought that God is somehow going to use this for my good, one of the most helpful things for me, and maybe for you, is being willing to reach out, to talk with another follower of Jesus, to share with them the pain that I'm experiencing, to share with them the weight that is going through my mind. And I found that in those moments, when I share that burden with someone else, my burden gets a little bit lighter. And it becomes a little bit easier for me to hold on to that hope that God is going to use all of this for his good some way. I'll be real, I don't know what that's going to look like for you. I don't even know when you're going to know that God has taken this horribly painful experience in your life and used it for good. But I believe that God is true to his word. And that when God somehow takes the pain that you're experiencing, maybe even right now, and he uses it for good, it's going to blow your mind. It's going to be the most incredible thing you've ever experienced. So even though this season tends to be so joyous for so many of us, maybe for you right now, you're feeling anything other than joy. Let me leave you with just 3 little words. Just hold on.